early modern imperialism, which ranged from the 15th century to the 18th century, there were many vast political transformations because larger, more powerful countries were taking over smaller, less powerful countries. And Britain was a major force in this because they were already a powerful country and they were expanding their power all over the world. In 19th century imperialism, there were new methods and more independent states and new governments that were being introduced all over the world. And again, Britain was a very powerful force in this. Also, slave trade was banned by Britain in 1807, and they also tried their best to make other countries ban slavery as well. Some radical political transformations that took place were Spain's empire extending from California to Texas to Portugal, and also extending to Florida. And America introduced the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which closed the Americas to European colonialism. Canada developed a relationship with Britain, which took some French territories, and France lost those territories in North America. Latin America shook Spanish control so they could become free, and in the Caribbean, war shifted power and ownership of its place from one country to another. In mercantilism, a nation's wealth depended on the amount of gold and silver that it had. And when one nation's trade went up, the other nation's trade went down. In free trade, which was supported by Adam Smith, was the exchange of goods across borders. Now, this was a laissez-faire form of economics, and more goods could be produced more cheaply. This fostered peace between nations, and it still dominated the economic theory in the West, and provided theoretical foundations for economic globalism. And with this form of economy, few tariffs and government regulations were taking place. And now for some questions from reviewers. Who was the leader in imperialism in the 18th century and 19th century? From Ignacio. Well, the answer to that question is Great Britain, because they ruled India and China, and they in themselves were very big countries, and since Britain was very powerful already, they just expanded their power over those two places and just gained even more. And our second question is, what was the Opium War? From Joe. The Opium War was when Britain wanted to trade with China and spend that power into China. But, you know, there were desirable goods in China, but China didn't want any goods from Britain. So Britain sold China opium, and it was a very addictive substance. So a lot of people in China were getting addicted to that, and it was ruining the empire. And the emperor told England to stop selling that, but England said no, and it eventually erupted into a huge war. And since Britain won, they got territory in China.
During this time, many political leaders came to believe that possessions of colonies would lead to the country that they were in would become more prosperous, they would become more powerful, and they would become more highly regarded among the other countries would regard them more highly. A lot of what was going on was to benefit the country. The leaders who went in and colonized didn't really care about the welfare or the well-being of the colonies. They kind of just went in, took what they wanted, and said, we're in charge now. So that was not something that the natives were happy about, and that's the reason that many nationalist uprising movements were formed, is because the natives just wanted the Europeans out so they could be in charge of themselves and only have to answer to themselves. Lenin, who became the dictator of Russia, he did not believe that imperialism was good. He did not like the things it did, and he said that it leads to monopoly. And since Lenin was a socialist, monopoly and free trade and all this is something that he did not believe in. Africa became basically the hotspot for European colonization, and basically every European country, including little tiny Belgium, they just wanted a piece of Africa. Africa was high in natural resources such as oil and gold and diamonds. Thank you. And it led to a lot of fighting and disagreement among European powers. For example, France and England fought over Egypt because of the strategic location by the Nile. And South Africa had been colonized by the Dutch in the early 15th century. But the British went in there, and the Dutch farmers had started to speak Afrikaans, which is a combination of the native African language and Dutch. And the British basically just kept pushing the the Boers, as they were called, the Dutch farmers, more north and more north, so they could colonize and take over the prosperous trade. Regular colonization that the Europeans had been practicing for centuries changed. For example, protectorates became very popular. Protectorates were when a government would go into a foreign country and they would pretty much just establish control, but they would kind of just let the government that already existed remain in power. Spheres of influence were when a country would go into just basically anywhere, and they would say, okay, this region is mine, and we're dominating all the trade here. We get to say who you can trade with, we say what you can trade, and we're basically going to say what you're allowed to grow. And this period was relatively brief, just about a century. It was mostly England. England was known for being the most popular, the biggest imperializing nation. During the age of imperialism, India was known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. For example, Britain just basically went into India and took over for their own interests. During the age of imperialism, since North America had won its independence, the interest in colonization shifted from Atlantic Ocean, like North America, South America, to Asia, such as India, China, Japan. And the effect of this is India becomes a base for military and commercial dominance throughout Asia for the British Empire. In India, it was ruled by the Mughal Empire, which was becoming increasingly weak year by year. And since Great Britain went in, basically just took over, the sepoys, which were the Indian troops that were paid to fight for the British, they rebelled. They failed, and England just became stronger than ever. And a major result of English colonization of India was deforestation, famines, the hand-weaving industry, which had been in India for basically forever. It was just completely ruined. The legal system was revised, which was a good thing, because the legal system there was very outdated. And there were many nationalist movements, which are both positive and negative. It's positive in that the Indians were feeling better about themselves and feeling more together, but it was bad for the British who became in charge. And I'm done!
And go!
Are you tired of fighting days on end to gain land for your country? Have no fear. Imperial juice is here.
Well, when you talk about Russia and mainland Asia, a few things come to mind, and certainly about the inordancy and the three-pronged development of the expansion from the Russians into the mainland Asia. In the 19th century, it's very similar to Britain and India in the way Britain took over India, in the sense that Britain just came in, and there's a few differences and similarities in the way that was conducted as that. So there are large territories and a lot of people conquered by the Russians when you look at in Asia, in the mainland. In the 18th century, they had control of the Baltic and other territories around there, a lot of Ukraine. You look at Chechnya and Caucasus. There's also the partitions of Poland, which helped the Russians extend their influence to the west, which is very interesting because it's a good strategy, because a lot of countries haven't thought of this, is that it helped them open the door to look to the east, where no major countries were there to stop their expansion. If you look at that, it's also to the weakness of the Ottomans and the Chinese.
So the Tsars controlled a lot of diverse groups of people. They usually did tolerate their religions and other social barriers between the two. So the inordinacies were nomadic societies in the north or south in Asia. And they used the four-stage social development cycle, which is sedentary people, hunters and gatherers, nomads, and that is the fourth stage. The goal was to raise people on the ladder of civilization. So when you look at the Western control of Asia, there's three parts basically: the papacy, the Spanish-American War, and the Boxer Rebellion. When you look at the papacy, French missionaries in Vietnam, they were in Vietnam as early as the 17th century. With papal support, they were able to gain Indochina and elsewhere in Asia between the 1830s and 1840s. Napoleon III sent forces to Vietnam to set up the base of operation for them, and that expanded also. French forces also took control of Saigon. By the 1880s, France controlled all of Vietnam and around that specific area, the Cambodia and the protectorates around there. In 1896, Laos was a French protectorate, and missionary work continued in Indochina, especially in Vietnam, where Catholics were a minority. The Spanish-American War, in 1853, U.S. Naval Squad under Matthew Perry arrived in Japan, and they opened a market to U.S. goods. American interest in Pacific increased dramatically, and they bought Alaska from Russia. The U.S. had a presence in the Pacific now, and Cuba revolts against Spain in the 90s, 1890s. This concerns, this creates a concern for Cuba, and the Americans were actually interested in Cuba, and they wanted to help them revolt against Spain. So the U.S. basically wins the war, the Spanish-American War, and Cuba becomes a protectorate for the Americans. And Americans also went on to get Philippines, Guam, and also other German territories. By the close of the 19th century, Western powers had forced the Chinese government to give them a lot and to force openings in their markets for them products. The missionaries also operated quite smoothly. The Chinese eventually said that's enough, and they actually revolted in something called the Boxer Rebellion, where the righteous and harmonious society of Fists actually revolted against the many spheres of influence that were in the control of the other foreign powers in the West. So there's a lot of important innovations and other things regarding to the expansion. We have steamboats invented by Robert Fulton, helping trade and expansion. They were actually made of iron, which is a coincidence because iron rusts. What an idiot! We also have the quinine pills. West Africa was a white man's graveyard, and quinine actually helped reduce malaria and yellow fever. Firearms actually changed a lot. You have the Maxim gun, which is a full machine gun ready to take out a bunch of native people, and some percussion caps for Thomas Shaw, and Enfield rifles, and other innovations in the weapons. We also have missionary work done in these native areas. We have the missionary work actually always didn't cooperate with the government, and also the goals of imperialism. Technically, missionaries and advocates of free trade could have mutually supported relationship, and also many things like that. A lot of also science involved in the imperial age: botany, zoology, medicine, and anthropology. Botany is a global agricultural things like helps spread a lot of trade around. Zoology, study of animals. Medicine is self-explanatory. Medicine it actually also helps convert people, and anthropology is basically a combination of a lot of sciences and social studies.